Okay, everyone. So it's 8:03. I think we might as well get started. People are going to keep trickling in, and that's great. But thank you all for attending. This is how to get a PhD in environmental engineering. It is so great to see everyone here. Hopefully you find this panel interesting and informative. We, the panelists, are really excited to be presenting this information to you. It's something that's close to all of our hearts, and we hope that it helps you in your decision on whether to apply to grad school and on how to do it, if you do decide to. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our fabulous panel. On the top left of my screen is Yash Amankar from my department. Yash, well, I'll let Yash introduce himself a bit in a few slides. We also have Lane To from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Edward Apraku from Stanford University. And yeah, it's our pleasure to be here with you today, and we will get started right now. I'm going to share some slides. Oh, before we begin, I'll just give an outline of what we're going to do here today. At first, we will present with some slides, and I'm going to ask that people hold their questions. If you have a question, maybe write it down to yourself or put it in the chat so that it's logged for when we get to the end of the presentation. And once we're at the end of the presentation, we will take questions. We will probably not have time to answer everyone's questions, but you can always feel free to get in touch with me over email. You should have my email, and I will do my best to answer you later on if we don't get to it. The presentation will have roughly two parts. One part kind of describing what environmental engineers do and what it's like to be a PhD student. And then the second part dealing with more practical tips on how to apply and how to make yourself competitive in the application process. Okay, let's get started. All right, people see my slides? We're good, panelists? Okay, so like I said, this is us. And maybe we can go around and each panelist can say a really short thing about who they are. Why don't we lead off with Lane?
Great, yeah. So I'm Lane. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a master's student at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, getting my degree in environmental engineering, specializing in energy, water, and environment sustainability. So I am not actually a PhD student, but I am writing a thesis. So I'm kind of here to provide that in-between insight in case you're not quite sure if you want a PhD or not.
Maybe I can go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Edward. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a second-year PhD student at Stanford. My research broadly focuses on electrochemistry, nutrient recovery, and ion exchange materials. I work in Will Tarpe's lab in the Department of Chemical Engineering here, focusing on getting valuable products from like waste streams. So a lot of that is like turning pee into like fertilizer and stuff like that. So yeah, super excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Yash Amankar. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Columbia University, the same department as Ian, and my research is focused on hydrology, but I also do climate risk assessments for water and energy infrastructure systems, and I'm kind of interested in the role of climate variability in the decarbonization of the energy sector.
That leaves me. I'm Ian Billinge. I use he, him pronouns. I'm also from Columbia, just like Yash. I study water treatment. So basically desalination is my main focus. Brine valorization, like Edward, I focus on getting good materials out of wastes and brines. I also dabble in some X-ray characterization as well. Yeah. All right. So we're gonna, Edward is gonna kick us off, I believe. And I will advance the slides.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we'll kind of just talk about what is environmental engineering, and what do PhD students do? Next slide. So PhD students mostly just focus on fundamental science and research. So we're creating like novel research that nobody's ever done before. And because of that, at the very end of it, you'll be a world-class expert in like a very narrow topic, but be able to like talk about a bunch of different adjacent topics within environmental engineering, resource recovery, etc. Your average lab day is spent doing like lab experiments if you're an experimentalist like myself, modeling if you're more so on the climate or like CS computational side, field work if you're more on like the environmental engineering like sciences side, as well as writing papers. That's the great unifier between all of us. And the duration of the PhD often depends on the department as well as your advisor, but most people just finish theirs in about 5 to 6 years. Next slide. Yeah, and then what is environmental engineering? So I know we have a wide range of people in the audience today. So we often study fundamental and applied problems relating to the environment. So in relation to civil engineering, who focus on structures and cities, chemical engineers who focus on scaling up chemical processes, or environmental science who study the natural and human altered environment, or material science who study like materials and their properties. So environmental engineering could like take aspects from all of these, but just focus on the environment and how the research that we're doing can affect the environment. Next slide. So I'll focus on the different kind of subsets within environmental engineering next in the next 4 slides. So first one being energy. So as an environmental engineer who's focused on energy, you could go from like energy generation, energy storage, green fuels, waste to energy, anything relating to like the energy sphere and how that could affect like the environment or just like storage, power grids, etc. Carbon capture is another aspect. This is more on like the air quality side of environmental engineering. So this could be materials that capture CO2, converting materials that could convert CO2 into useful molecules, carbon uptake, as well as carbon sequestration, all with the like great unifier of carbon. Good. And then water. So this is like the main one that a lot of people work on. So this could be protecting drinking water from contaminants, environmental remediation by removing toxic metals, recovering nutrients like I do, monitoring pathogens if you're on the environmental and microbiology side. If you're on the urban water system side, developing smart responsive water systems, as well as just like studying inequalities from water supply and quality. So anything dealing with the remediation of water or the development of like just cleaning up water is typically on the water side of environmental engineering. Next slide. And yeah, we also have modeling. So researching the impacts of climate change on these different subsects from like human health, agriculture to water supply. And there is like a lot more that you could also include in the modeling aspect, not just these. Yeah, and then, yeah, so environmental engineering is like a really broad topic. So you could be more on like the topics that I just listed, or since I work in a chemical engineering lab, I know like a lot of us do like catalysis and separations. So if you're into that, that is also a part of environmental engineering, as well as green materials, pollution remediation, and remote sensing. But yeah, what you end up studying will probably depend on your advisor and not the name of the department. So if you're in like a really interdisciplinary lab, you could be focusing on like materials, material science, or like chemical engineering, civil engineering. You're pretty much going to be like a conversationalist in a lot of different engineerings, all with an environmental focus. And then finally, if the environmental department at your school is outside of your desired area, another department could be a better fit. So I think it's really important to like do a broad search of like the different departments at schools that you're looking into to see if they could potentially have like a lab that is focused on something that you like are interested in, or potentially in like the School of Earth at your university. Yeah, and also next talk about what do you do after getting a PhD. So if you want to be a professor, you definitely need a PhD in order to do this. I think a vast majority of people are often on this path, going in at least, but you will have to do a postdoc right after your PhD. So this is just a continuation essentially of your PhD, but you'll have 1 to 3 years, so shorter than the actual PhD. And then you'll do maybe 1 to 2 postdocs before actually applying to faculty positions. And oftentimes this is a pretty competitive path. for being completely honest, and a lot of PhD students don't end up securing tenure track positions at university. Also, professors are underpaid relative to their experience. So oftentimes, like if you're in a group of like 10 PhD students under one advisor, and you all want to be a tenure track professor, only like one student could theoretically replace like your advisor. So it is a pretty competitive path, but it's not the only path, and I'll talk about it a bit more. Next slide, please. Industry. So this varies depending on like what your PhD, like the characterization or like skills that you acquire for them. But you can work in a company that's relative to your field. But yeah, but if your goal is to like just go straight into industry, there's probably like a more direct route than like an entire PhD, like an MS or something equivalent. But yeah, and then every PhD, it's a lot of just like problem solving, and you become an expert on a task that you like built up yourself, and it's often like very complicated. So these are skills that are also transferable to industry as well. Slide. Yeah, also if you want to work in the public sector, that's something a lot of environmental engineers are like passionate about. So Ian and Yash kind of talked about this panel where the EPA and like these other federal agencies were looking to hire environmental engineers just because of like definitely the climate crisis. And then there's also the AAAS Science and Technology Fellows. So this is a great program where you're actually paired up with a congressperson in Washington, D.C., and you get to focus on like environmental issues on a local and national level. Additionally, you can like, but I guess the pay is usually lower for the public sector, but you get to have a huge impact. But you also you look at national labs. So the US is really big on that. And then you could work as a staff scientist. If you really just want to continue research, but not like be a professor, you could that is an option that you could explore as well.
Cool. So I will wait for the echo to subside. Okay, great. So I'm going to cover the next section, practical matters. So PhD students do get paid for their work. The salary and benefits will vary widely depending on your department, university, cost of living in the area, whether you're a public or private university, if you're in a big city or in the middle of nowhere. So for example, at Columbia University, that's in New York City, as you all know, huge cost of living. Students there get up to $45,500 a year. Stanford, Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, expensive place to live. Students there get paid $50,000 a year. UIUC is in the middle of Illinois, small town, very little going on. We get paid a lot less, $26,000 per year. And if you have an NSF graduate research fellowship, that stipend is $37,000 per year. And depending on the university, these might be a year-long appointment, so you get paid every month. They might be an 11-month appointment or a 9-month appointment without summer funding, depending on your situation. So other benefits that you get as a PhD student, because you are an employee of the university, you usually get free or subsidized health insurance. Some universities will also have access to housing through their university, so you can go through the university to get your housing, but you still have to pay rent. And so you don't have to go independently search for a landlord, something like that. And it's most relevant in areas like New York with expensive housing. So for example, at my school, we don't really have that. It's mostly for international students, and everybody else just kind of finds their own housing. Overall, the salary and benefits, as you saw, are not very competitive with industry. However, you are getting paid to get your degree, so you're kind of getting paid to do school. And at the same time, you are making an investment towards your future career, and you're getting your tuition waived. So there are some benefits on the other side of things. So this is a question that people wonder a lot. Is there an advantage for doing a PhD over a master's? So a master's degree usually takes 1 to 2 years. And if you're doing a coursework-based master's, then oftentimes you'll have to pay the university tuition like you did in undergrad. Or you could get a scholarship, but those are harder to come by compared to in undergrad. And so when you do a coursework-based master's, you'll spend your time taking classes. Some people also do research on the side. And some might write a thesis. There are thesis-based master's programs depending on the university. So that's what I'm in, for example. So I only do classes like half the time, like 2 classes, and then I spend the rest of my time doing research, and I get a stipend because of that. There's not a huge increase in salary for PhDs over master's holders in industry because a lot of times people, like Edward said earlier, a lot of folks can go into industry with a master's, and you'll get paid about the same amount. But if you want, if you want a high salary, PhD might not be a great use of your time, but depending on the trade-offs. However, if you want to be in academia, in faculty, you want to be a lead researcher or a PI on a project, some industries and positions will give better salaries or opportunities for advancement if you have a PhD. So if you want to be a lead scientist at a company, for example, you might want a PhD. So do your research and look into the industry that you want to go into and see what kind of jobs are out there and what degree requirements they have. Do you need a master's program to apply to a PhD program? No. Many PhD programs are straight from undergrad, so you can apply straight from undergrad, and you'll get paid like a PhD student as you're earning your master's degree. So a lot of times people will enter without a master's and they'll get their master's along the way. Wrapped up in that 5 to 6 years that they're doing their PhD program. Sometimes people will come in with a master's, and then that can take some time off of their total amount of years in their PhD program. Like I said before, other schools offer thesis-based MS degrees, which have the same financial benefits such as waived tuition, and you get a stipend, health insurance, stuff like that. Same benefits as a PhD program, but without the several years of commitment. So if you're still kind of trying to figure out if you like research or if you might want to get a job in industry instead of academia, for example, you might want to look at a thesis-based master's. And depending on the school, MS or PhD students might be involved in teaching. At some schools, it's a requirement to be a TA for at least a semester. In others, it's up to the student. If that student is interested in academia, then they might pursue more TA options. So that might also be something that you work on as you get your degree and do your research and take classes. Okay, so the components of a PhD application, there are many. The big one that people always talk about is the statement of purpose or your personal statement. You might see different terms for it, but it means the same thing. It's the same document. Letters of recommendation, usually 3 of them, your academic transcripts from undergrad. Sometimes it used to be much more common that you would need your GRE exam scores. Now a lot of schools are waiving that. Sometimes schools will ask you for a diversity statement, but not every school does. And then your resume or CV, if you're an international student, your TOEFL English proficiency exam. And usually universities expect you to have done some research ahead of time. So they will usually ask you to list professors who you want to work with in that department. And finally, most schools make you pay a fee to apply. So the personal statement or the statement of purpose, here's a quote from Georgia Skander, who went to undergrad with me and Ian, and is now a physics PhD student at UChicago, I believe. He's also pretty famous on Twitter. He says, the statement of purpose ultimately needs to be a narrative, but one that is professional and succinct, that covers what research you've done in undergrad, what your research interests are, why that program that you're applying to, and what you can bring. So it has to be personalized to each department that you apply to. What you want to do generally is have like a core statement and then kind of personalize that for each department. So you're not rewriting a whole new statement for every school, but you do want to make sure you include something that speaks to that university or department. So for example, you could mention a few professors that you want to work with and why you think you could work with them. Another thing is that you want to keep this short. Most schools will require that you don't go over 2 pages. Some might have even stricter requirements like a word limit or something like that. In general, professors don't read them in that great detail, so they will just skim it, especially if you're on the longer side of things. So definitely pay attention to that word limit, page limit. One thing that you definitely want to do is show, not tell when you're writing your statement. So giving concrete examples, describing outcomes, describing skills that you've learned, challenges, and using a story or using an experience to show something that you want to tell the application committee or admissions committee. Yeah. There's also, we will send the slides after this. So there are some links that you can see. When you click on that, you can get to that link later on. So there are some topics that are considered like a kiss of death in personal statements. Even though it's called a personal statement, you don't want to get too personal. So stories from your childhood or oversharing about your personal life. Obviously, if you've overcome certain obstacles in your life to get to where you are and they're relevant to your career or why you want to go to grad school, this is a great place to talk about that. Or for example, if you have a non-traditional background, you do want to talk about things personally, but there are lines and there are things that would be considered oversharing. So you do have to keep that in mind. And also talking about unrelated professional experience can also be kind of a kiss of death, as they say. So this is the biggest part of your application. It's the hardest part. It's going to take the most time. And you want to make sure you have many drafts and get as many people's feedback on it as possible. Okay, I'm not going to read through all of these, but here's some examples of what departments ask for. They'll usually do like bullet points and they're kind of all the same. So they'll say like your preparation for this field of study, what your research interests are, what your future career plans are, why this program fits into your overall goals. So like, I want to be a professor. I need to get a PhD. This program fits into this for this reason. I have these research interests, thus I'm applying to this program. They're all generally pretty similar. Yeah, you can look at these in more detail later on when we send the slides, but these are just some examples.
Oops.
Oh, and okay, next part, letters of recommendation. So most programs require 3 letters, like I said, and this is actually a very important part of your application. You don't want to ask recommenders at the last minute to write you a letter. A lot of people leave this to the last minute because it's not something they personally have to write or do, but that's a bad mistake. So a great letter of recommendation can strongly enhance your application, and a bad one, or one that's maybe written in 2 days because you asked someone to write it really late, that can be really bad for your application. So the best recommenders are professors or supervisors who you've worked with in academic research or in industry work. So maybe if you're working right now, someone who's your direct supervisor, or if you did research in a lab in undergrad, for example, a professor who was your PI or your advisor. So if you're working in a STEM capacity, then someone who's been your advisor or direct supervisor is going to be a good choice. And a second good choice is professors or academic advisors from your STEM classes or other STEM work that you've done. Next slide. Okay. And one thing that comes up is non-STEM recommenders. So obviously we all have varied lives and are not just scientists. So people might wonder if we can ask professors or mentors from non-STEM contexts to be recommenders. I know I personally asked one of my job supervisors in undergrad at the LGBT Center to be my recommender because he watched me, grow through my 4 years working for him. And yeah, so these recommenders, they might hold less weight because they're not in STEM, but they can also be really valuable sometimes. So for example, if they can speak to your journey, your personality, your growth, like I said, my work advisor who knew me for 4 years knew me way more than any STEM professor I had. Like that's a good example of a non-STEM person who could write you a strong letter. They can speak to something about you that's relevant to grad school, or they can speak to some personal aspect of your journey that is important for the admissions committee to know. One thing that I will note though is that you don't want more than one of your recommenders to be non-STEM. It's preferable that your first 2 recommenders are in STEM and then your third person can be somebody else. And this is very similar to, I believe, undergrad admissions too, but you won't be able to see the letters that your recommenders write. And it's customary for them to just send them directly to the university. There might be a waiver box. I don't remember if that's a thing still, but I think there's sometimes a box that you check, like I waive my right to look at this. Generally, you do want to do that if you're asked. So when you are talking to your potential recommenders, you always want to ask them, do you think you could write me a favorable recommendation? Don't just go and say like, will you do this for me? Because there's a chance that they might not be able to. And you want to make sure that you're getting good recommendations and you're not like forcing someone's hand to write you a recommendation that is like kind of mediocre. And so you can gauge from their response usually if someone doesn't feel like they're able to write you a favorable recommendation. Sometimes they'll say it really politely, but you can usually tell. But if they say yes, and it's very direct, then you can tell them about what you'll usually do is send them a list of the programs you're applying to, send them your personal statement, your CV, just so they know like the full picture of you applying, in case anything's changed since they last talked to you, because most of the time you're asking people who you haven't seen maybe in a year or two since you graduated. And then, yeah, you'll want to highlight specifics of what you did with that person. So a lab professor might not remember what you did in a research project. So it doesn't hurt to say like, oh, hey, like I contributed this specific part to this specific project. Some of them will ask you to draft the letter yourself, which that has not happened to me, but you can look up online examples of letters for that if that happens to you. And yeah,
It's happened
maybe
to me.
somebody else can do that. That has
my-
never happened to me.
Yeah, my PI has asked me to write my own recommendation letter, and then he took it and ran with it, I guess. I don't know what the end result was. I didn't get to see it, but yeah, it does happen.
Yeah, so don't be too taken aback if that does happen. You will survive. Right, and then academic transcript. So you'll want to show them your grades from undergrad. If you have a master's and you're applying for a PhD, then you'll want to include those. You're not going to need anything from high school. Hopefully people already know that. And it's good to have good grades from a relevant major, but overall high GPA isn't necessarily going to be make or break. It's not like law school or medical school where GPA is a huge factor. If you have a subpar GPA, less than average GPA, it's totally worth it to still apply. As long as you can tell a compelling story in your personal statement about what your motivations are and speak to your ability, why you want to be doing research. And this is also where your personal statement and your recommendation letters will really matter, because if you don't necessarily have the best grades, you'll definitely want to make a case for yourself in your other application materials. And this includes gaps in your transcript or resume. Those can also be addressed in letters or in personal statements. So your resume or your CV, depending on what your field is, it should show your past professional activities, and especially when you're applying to PhD programs, you'll want it to show any past scientific research you've done or professional scientific or engineering activities. If you have any publications or conference presentations, you'll want to put those in. So in that case, you're going to want to have a CV for the most part. A resume is not going to fit all of those things. I would recommend if you're applying for a PhD to have a CV, because you want to include all the details of if you have done a presentation, you want to put those in there. And then you want to list things in order of importance, not chronological order. And then finally, you also want to highlight some soft skills or technical skills. I know I have language skills on mine, and it's always nice to have an extra blurb at the end with those extra skills. All right, so the GRE, it's required by many, but not all environmental engineering programs. Since COVID has happened, I think a lot more programs have started veering towards that being optional. But if you do want to take it, just so you know, it has math, writing, and reading comprehension components. It's very similar to the SAT if you've taken that, with some extra writing sections. So you'll want to have, get a preparation book or find some online materials, and spend a couple months leading up to your GRE to practice, do some practice tests, that kind of thing. It's good to get this out of the way before you apply, so you know what your score is and can kind of have a gauge for like what's within the range of schools that you can apply to based on that. There is no environmental engineering specific standardized test. That's good to note. But you can learn more about the GRE at ets.org. So fees, most schools do charge an application fee, and it is not a low fee either. Sometimes some schools I've seen are around $50, but a lot of them will be upwards of $70 to $100. So sometimes departments will give you fee waivers if you meet certain criteria. That was very common in undergrad, I believe, but I think for grad school, it's a lot harder to get fee waivers. But you can always check the departmental website and see whether or not that department offers some kind of funding or fee waiver. Sometimes it's first come, first serve, so check as early as you can. Virtual PhD programs, I did not know this, often provide fee waivers. So if you want to check the schools you're interested in, you can see if they have virtual programs and you might be able to save some money. If you have GRE scores and the school you're applying to needs those, you also have to pay for every school that you send your GRE scores to. If you did undergrad in the US, this will be very familiar to you. It's a lot like the undergrad process with your standardized test scores and stuff like that.
I have a question for the panelists. This is just from me. What is a virtual PhD program?
Okay, I thought that was supposed to be a virtual PhD preview. So that was something I did a lot my senior year. Since my senior year was class 21, a lot of the previews were virtual. And I got like a ton of fee waivers just by like kind of attending like a 3-day webinar by different universities. So I know like Stanford, Northwestern, Princeton, University of Michigan, MIT, UT Austin, like they all had the different like PhD previews. And through that, I was able to get like a bunch of fee waivers.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Awesome.
So that is a typo.
We'll fix it before we send it. That's great to know. I didn't know that. That's awesome. Okay, so we've heard all about the components, but now I'm going to talk about the timeline of the components, because some of you may be thinking of applying even this year or thinking to the future. So it's good to know what the order is and how to get it done effectively. So overall, this is a kind of a broad framework for how you can apply to a PhD program. The summer before applying, I should say that the applications open in September, right? So the summer before you apply, you will want to start doing your research. You want to start looking around at the different universities, looking into research groups there and find ones that appeal to you. And if at all possible, if you want to take the GRE, it's good to get it out of the way like in advance, right around now. In September, applications open. In October, there's something called the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, which is due, which we will talk about more in a bit. In the kind of summer all the way through to when your applications are due, you can reach out to professors. We'll talk about that in a second. Actually, we'll be going through all of these points in further slides. But the applications will all be due in December through January. And I just want to note from personal experience that I really got burned here because I didn't appreciate at the time that December is also when all of my finals were. So I was absolutely slammed with work, trying to complete all of my finals and also apply to all of these grad schools. So this is another reason you really want to be on top of the process so you don't cause problems for yourself come December. Between January and March, you'll get some decisions. You'll hear back either acceptances or rejections, but there's kind of no standard dates, unlike in undergrad in the US, when you'd hear back on a certain date. It's very, it's kind of random, and you kind of are left wondering like when you're going to hear back from anyone. And then April will be about the time when you have to commit. Okay, so in detail, I want to talk about researching your options. So I recommend that you start doing this in the summer before you apply through maybe November or so. This is a good time to be doing it. In terms of researching your options, you basically want to look up groups at different universities and find ones that appeal to you. It's important to know that most groups have a website which is separate from their departmental website. And this group website is usually where the good stuff is. So for example, my advisor has a profile on the Earth and Environmental Engineering website of Columbia. But there's not much detail there. And so for the real detail, the real good stuff to see who's in the lab and the lab's focus, you'll want to head to this second hyperlink, which is the YIP Lab group website, which we maintain. Now, when looking at labs, you really want to look at the lab atmosphere. It's really important. And you can usually gauge it by the website. So, for example, I think everyone here would probably be interested in a lab that has a strong commitment to diversity and equity and community outreach and that kind of thing. You can usually tell, you can usually gauge that by the website. Also, it's usually good if you have a lab that has something of a social life, right? Most labs will have kind of activity pages or some photos from their outings, or many of them do in any case. And you can kind of gauge that. And then finally, all of these lab websites will have the grad students and postdocs who are currently working in the group and their contact information. And it's actually okay to reach out to these people and ask them a few questions if you're interested. They may even invite you to a group meeting. It has happened. And in that case, you'll get a front row seat into what the group is and how it works. You may also want to look up the pay and benefits information, but that is usually not on the lab website. So you're going to want to go to the department website for that and have a little look around, and you'll see, how much they pay and what they provide and stuff. All right, so in terms of researching your options, it's also really important to write to professors. This is one of those unwritten things that is kind of accepted, which is, hugely unjust that they don't just come out and tell you. However, some labs do have instructions about whether the professor wants to be contacted before applying. So again, to use my advisor as an example, you can see from the screenshot at the top that he says that interested applicants should contact him before applying to Columbia. So this is very important. And the way to do it is an email. So you just send the professor a polite email, and it's usually okay to do this even if they don't explicitly ask for it. They may not get back to you. That's okay. They're really busy. They get hundreds of emails a day. You can bump them, but if they don't respond to the bump, I would probably say just let them be. They won't appreciate being pestered. When you do write your email, I would say keep it brief and keep it polite. They appreciate brevity. State your interest and your intentions up front. It's often a good idea to read or skim a couple of their papers and to use that to ask a thoughtful question or two about their research. And there is a sample letter that can be found here. You'll be able to click on that when we send the slides. And it's also good to look at their lab website. Another reason it's good to look is sometimes they just don't have funding and they can't take students this year. Or sometimes they definitely are saying that they are recruiting. So it's good to look out for that. One thing I will say, if you haven't done this yet and you're quietly panicking in this Zoom meeting, don't worry, it's not too late. I didn't reach out until about this time in my PhD process. It wasn't ideal, but I got it done. So yeah, you can start now. Don't delay. And then the last point is just don't waste their time. Only write if you're genuinely interested. Oops, I went backwards. Okay, so that's writing to professors. What about writing to PhD students? So this is just my opinion. The other panelists may actually disagree with me, and that's okay. I think it's okay to write to PhD students and ask them a little bit about their research and experience in the lab. They may not answer you. They have, their own stuff going on. But if you don't ask, you don't get. So you might as well try. There's little downside. And asking for a 10 or 15-minute conversation could be really illuminating for you about to find out about the research priorities and the atmosphere in the group. Okay, letters of recommendation. So Lane talked about this a lot as well. And this one is very important to be as early as you can be. So you want to find your recommenders in summer through maybe October would be like the absolute latest, but October is pushing it. You want to find your recommenders and ask them for a short meeting, as we discussed, and you will talk about your plans and ask them whether they can recommend you. You're going to want to give them plenty of time because they're also busy. A month is considered a fast turnaround time for a letter of recommendation. And just keep in mind that they'll also be busy during the semester. So it's ideally, do it in the summer. It will only help you. But again, if you are trying to do it now and you need to start in a hurry, you can try. In terms of writing your personal statement, this is another one that can, take a long time. It's helpful to start writing early in the summer even. Bearing in mind that in the semester you're busy with classes, especially come December, but you can write your statement more quickly if necessary. Like if you want to start now, it's not too late. With that said, the quality of your writing will improve a lot with different iterations. So rewriting it and having reviews, so that you'll have a much higher quality product by the end if you start early and you iterate often. And also another important part about working on your personal statement is it makes you think about yourself and what you want to accomplish and what you want to be doing for the next few years. And often you discover things about yourself that will actually impact where you apply or whether you apply at all to grad school. So it's good to do this just even as an exercise to help you decide what you're going to be doing. If you're also clear on this, when you go to talk to your recommenders, you can be really clear and specific about what your motivations are. And this will result in you getting better quality, more specific letters of recommendation. And then finally, you should ask all kinds of people for feedback when you're in the writing process. Your academic mentors are huge. If you're friendly with any PhD students, that is good. Friends and family can provide a great perspective. And actually, you can ask me. This is an open invitation. People who are here right now, if you're applying, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to look through it, give some feedback, talk about it. Please, I encourage you to avail yourself of this opportunity. Okay, so once you've submitted your applications, first thing you do is you breathe a big sigh of relief. And then you start twiddling your thumbs and waiting around for decisions. And they'll arrive sometime between January and March, most of them in March, to be honest. Many schools will invite you to an on-site visit. That means that they want you to come to them. Now, it's customary for them to pay all of your expenses on these visits, like the necessary expenses, that is. But confusingly, in environmental engineering, they may take different forms, these visits, and it's not always easy to tell which is which. So in the case, sometimes you're given an offer before you visit. And in that case, it's very straightforward. The purpose of the trip is for them to sell you on coming to the school, which is always nice. Sometimes you don't have an offer given to you pre-visit. And it may be the case that they are planning to give you an offer, but they just want to meet you in person and see that you're a nice person before extending the offer. And finally, it may be that you have no offer given before the visit and they're actually bringing a bunch of people to interview and they're going to take some subset of them. This happened to me. I arrived somewhere and there were about 20 prospective students and they told us we're going to take 10 of you. So that was very stressful. And unfortunately, it's hard to know what's going to be the case ahead of time. I will say, do not accept an offer until you visit, if at all possible. You should definitely make the trip and get a vibe check. Always a good idea. Bring your A game on all visits, of course, no matter the context. And then, last thing, do communicate with professors. Like if you accept another offer, let the other programs know that you're not going to be coming so that they can pursue other candidates. It's just polite. Okay, I'm going to hand it over for general thoughts.
Do I have control of the slide or?
I don't think so, but if you want to do a new share, you can do that. Otherwise,
no,
I've just been advancing the slides.
Yeah, just go to the next slide. Yep. Thank you so much, Ian. Yeah, so overall, one of the most important things is you want to choose the advisor and not the department. Your relationship with your advisor will make or break your PhD. And because you're working far closer with your advisor than the department in general. And like two types of faculty you might have is if your potential advisor is early career faculty, they might have more time to give you. So you might have weekly meetings or more frequently, they're not traveling across the world giving lectures and so on. With established faculty, they do not have that much time to give you. So what happens in that sense is you have a hierarchical structure where a lot of your advising is done by a senior postdoc rather than the faculty themselves. But on the other side, like once you get out of there, you have more opportunities and greater lab resources. So you want to find out what works better for you. And in most and also there are like two kinds of admissions. In certain programs, they will admit you without you having a primary advisor. So for the first year, you will rotate between different labs, and at the end of the year or at the end of your qualifiers, you select one lab. Most other departments, including the ones like Ian and I, the one Ian and I am in, you reach out to your advisor, and from day one, basically, you are working with that lab. And you join the PhD program contingent on the assumption that you will be working with XYZ professor because they are funding you. And in general, like the applications for the PhD programs, first is they're read by the admissions committee, and there you make a list of either if you've reached out to a particular faculty member, they'll basically what do you call, take your admissions in a separate pile and keep it that way, or if not, during your application process you will have a chance to, like, say I'm interested in working with one of 2 or 3 faculty members, so they basically they are highlighted like, okay, so and so candidate is interested to work with them. So you want to tailor your statement of purpose just for them, because there are, like, again, correct me, the other panelists can correct me if you're wrong, there are like 2 kinds of admissions filtering which happens. One is the department has a basic list of like, okay, we want this cutoff, this cutoff, this cutoff, and that's pretty like almost like those aren't high cutoffs for your GPA, GRE, and other sorts of things. Once that is done, your application basically goes to the 1 or 3 people you say you were interested in working with, and they have to say yes. Once they say yes, the department generally doesn't care that much. So you want to tailor your SOP for those people rather than making a far general SOP. So it's like you could keep 1 paragraph or just like thread the narrative in such a way that those 3 faculty members might be interested in it.
I will take this one really quickly. I mentioned the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, also known as the GRFP. This is a grant that the government, the National Science Foundation awards, and you have to be a US citizen or a national or a permanent resident to apply for it. Actually, Edward, I believe, has won it. I did not win it. And if you're so lucky as to win it, the government will pay your salary for 3 years, essentially. So this makes you a much more attractive prospect for advisors. If you can come to them and say, hey, I'm free for 3 years, they will usually just take you right away. So the rules and conditions of this fellowship are that you're allowed to apply once before you have a master's degree and once after. That's like the simplified version of the rules. So if you're coming from undergrad or if you don't have a master's degree, it's a good idea to apply before, to apply to the NSF GRFP before you apply to your PhD programs. For one thing, it shows seriousness, which is always good. And if you win it, your options will be greatly expanded. But another thing is, since the GRFP is due in October, it forces you to have like most of your application ready ahead of time. So it makes you get all your ducks in a row and saves you time later on down the road. If you already have a master's degree, it's more of a toss-up on whether it's the best idea to apply. I would say maybe don't apply, because you're limited to just 1 application attempt once you do have your master's. So if you don't get it, that's it. And your application will probably be stronger once you're in a research group and can draw on that expertise. But yeah, other panelists may disagree with me on that. All right, back to you, Yash. Oh, I can present this as well. So there's been a ton of information thrown at you. We have compiled a couple of really great resources for grad school applications. And this says for a great personal statement, but I would actually amend that to for having a great application. As mentioned before, George Iskander has a really great guide online, and I would encourage everyone to read through it. George is a physicist, but pretty much all of the points are relevant here. Renew It, REU, is a kind of like research collaboration group that I believe Edward may be a part of. It's really great in the water space, and they have a comprehensive guide on applying to grad school, which you can find at that link. And finally, Alex Lang has also come up with some really great examples of NSF GRFP material. So you're going to want to check out these kind of things if you're applying. Yeah, and now for some more information on international candidates, back to Yash.
Yeah, so whatever was said was just generally for everyone. Here is like some additional steps you might have to do if you're an international candidate. Just a bit of disclosure, I am an Indian citizen, and like I believe like what all I will say will be general, but might change a lot depending on your citizenship, because the rules are like different if you're from particular countries. So what would be the additional requirements for you as an additional candidate, international candidate? So if you've done your previous schooling outside of the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, you will require the test of English proficiency. Most of the times it's TOEFL, but sometimes they accept IELTS too. Just an important point to remember is the scores for these are just valid for 2 years, and unlike the GRE, which is for 5. So you do not want to take it too far away from your date of application. The other thing is, if your undergrad institution, for example, is in France or Germany, and the transcripts are not in English, you might want to get an official translation of your transcripts and then submit the English ones to your institutions. Some of them ask that, some of them don't, but you will require at the final time during admission. And in some cases, you might need your degree accredited, and for that you'd have to go to the World Education Services. If I'm not wrong, that costs about like $150, and that takes about a week of your time, but the process is fairly easy. Then the next, can we go to the next slide, Ian? Yes. So first, if you've gotten an offer, congratulations on that. Once you get an offer and you accept it, you will get your I-20 from your university. The moment you get your I-20, you should make an appointment at the US consulate in your country. Like, a point I want to make is, since the pandemic, the waiting times have gone completely insane in most places. For example, in India, when I filed my visa a couple of years ago before the pandemic, I got an appointment within a year. Right now, you're not getting them for a year, within a month. Right now, you're not getting them for a year ahead. So you might want to plan for that. And it's pretty bad in most countries. Once you get the appointment, you want to start working on your papers needed for the visa interview. Those differ from country to country, but that is a very comprehensive task. And it's also, you want to be a bit careful depending on what area of work you are in, so that like the State Department can be a little bit tricky if you're working on, like, for example, nuclear physics or so on. Then they might do a more thorough background research on you, and that might take longer, and you might get delayed for a term or two. Because we are environmental engineers, it's fine unless you're working in like battery manufacturing or so on. I don't think that should matter a lot. And like, for the most important thing I would say is, if you get accepted in a school from day one, start reaching out to your school's international students office. Most major universities have them, and they're fairly responsive. Just give them a week's time and just shoot them an email if you have any questions and so on. Yes. One more slide. And what is life like as an international PhD candidate? So you will must have a F1 visa, and the biggest issues for you will be tracking your work time and traveling outside the United States. In my experience, you have some issues getting paid initially, because they want to just make sure your paperwork and all is done and you are registered as an international student. But once that's done, it's smooth sailing since after that. Your most important document as an international PhD student will be your I-20. A valid I-20 means you can legally stay in the United States. A valid visa is for traveling outside the United States or making your first entry. An important point is, you can be a student as long as you have a valid I-20, even if you have a valid visa, expired visa. So your visa is just a document to enter the country, but your I-20 has to be valid to stay as a student. And one important point you want to make sure is, you do not exceed more than 20 hours during the semester, which is the spring and the fall term, because if you exceed that, that is a violation of your visa criteria and you might get deported. And the work limit during the summer is 40 hours. So if you want to do an internship, you can do that over the summer, but you might want to talk to your advisor about that. The other thing is, you will have different tax implications. This is also highly dependent on the country you're from and what are the tax treaties between the United States and your home country. And as always, just like reach out to the school's international students office, and they're generally good at answering any of your questions. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, that's everything. Thank you all for your attention. We'll take some questions in a second. But if you have questions after the panel, feel free to reach out to me. This is kind of I'll be the gateway for general questions. However, if there are some questions that you think should really be answered by one panelist in particular, you could also reach out to the panelists at these email addresses. So yeah, with that said, I will stop the screen share, and I invite questions from the attendees. You could unmute yourself, or you could put in the chat. And yeah, we'll go for just a few minutes. I think Edward might have to leave quite soon, but yeah, we'll try and open it up for questions. Okay, while they're thinking of some, I have some questions. This one is for Lane. So Lane, my question for you is, if you're doing your thesis-based master's, does that take longer than a kind of normal master's program? How long are you expecting to spend at UIUC in this phase?
That's a good question. No, it shouldn't take much longer. So the requirements are just different, at least at my university. This could differ depending on different universities. So here, your master's takes 2 years. You can do a coursework master's and you take more classes, and that's 2 years, or you do a thesis master's and it's still 2 years, but you take less classes. And I think it's about half as many classes. And then the other half of your credits are fulfilled by doing research. And then, yeah, you write your thesis and you submit that, and should be done in 2 years. Sometimes people take an extra summer.
Cool. That's great to know. I honestly, personally don't know as much about this. I think it's really, people like really flying under the radar. I didn't even know it was an option, but it sounds like a great option.
Yeah, not every school has it, but here at UIUC, we only recently just started taking direct to PhD students in our department. Oh, bye, Edward. Yeah, and so before that, people would just apply for their master's and go kind of do a checkpoint and then go on for their PhD. It's really nice for people who aren't sure if a PhD is their end goal. So I knew I liked research, but I wasn't sure if what I wanted to do in the future would necessarily need a PhD. Maybe I want to work at a national lab, that kind of a thing. So being able to just do a master's and then kind of reevaluate afterwards has been really nice, especially with the funding and everything.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat from Abdullah. Abdullah says, I'm interested in applying for a master's degree in UIAC. How can I find or look for scholarships? What is UIAC? I don't know.
Maybe he means UIUC. I will wait for a response. In general, though, I think you can search Google and there's a lot of master's specific scholarships that you can find. I will say it's a lot harder to find scholarships for a master's program if you aren't doing a thesis-based master's. I believe there's a variety of diversity-related scholarships that you could apply for that will fund a master's. There's the Point Foundation Scholarship for LGBT students that funds master's programs. There is, I think there's a diversity in environmental engineering or something gosh, I don't remember. It's environmental science and engineering, but I think that also funds masters, but I can look for the links and send them if you're interested.
We have another question as well. Yeah, Abdullah did mean UIUC. We have another question, which is, how important is research experience to the application? If I don't have any research background, does that decrease my competitiveness? Do you want to take this one, Yash?
Yes, I wouldn't say that. I would say that just a bit, and depends on the program or not. But they just want to see, most of all, they want to see that you should have a interest in research. I think that's the number one thing. And having a lack of a research background, I don't think hinders you that much at all. Because like if you've taken STEM courses, you've done a lot of, you've almost there to what you require to do for research. So it's like, I wouldn't say it's, yeah, doesn't decrease your competitiveness by a lot. No, it's just, you want to just in your statement of purpose and all, you want to get, main point you would want to get across is just like your interest in doing research more than anything else.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I personally did do research in undergrad, but I got almost nothing done, to be honest. And it didn't adversely affect me too much. All right, another question. If I'm working on a research team, would it be better to get the letter of rec from the professor or the graduate student that I worked with? Okay, I can take this one. The professor. Unfortunately, the 3 recommenders cannot be grad students or postdocs, I believe. For whatever reason in academia, they're just not kind of seen as like a valid letter of recommendation. It has to be a professor or a supervisor, something like that, to be like really credible. They just won't respect it otherwise, I'm afraid. All right, Edson says, how common is it for a school to fund your master's/PhD? Lane, maybe?
Yeah, I can take that. If you, for just the PhD, I'd say it's pretty common, like most in the US at least, it's pretty much standard to be paid during your PhD. Most schools will have a policy where they will only admit you if they can promise that they will fund you. So you won't go unfunded. Your advisor will usually have funding from some source. You might have eventually, if you run out of funding, because you're on a limited fellowship or something like that, you might have to TA for a semester, which is like the worst case scenario, but like you will not end up in a situation where you have to pay the university for your PhD instead of you getting a stipend. In terms of masters, it's pretty uncommon to get funding for a coursework-based master's. Those are usually self-funded unless you can find a scholarship or a fellowship. I do have a list of different fellowships that do fund master's programs that I can forward to Ian so he can send it with the rest of the presentation materials. But yeah, if you do a research-based thesis-based master's, which is research-based, then you're a research assistant, you work for the university and you do get funding. So that can largely depend on the department or the university. I'd recommend looking at the universities or departments that you're interested in and seeing if they offer a thesis-based master's. Those are usually the ones that will be funded. Coursework masters are harder to get funded.
Yeah, I should add, of course, like if you're going to do your PhD, but you don't yet have a master's degree, usually what will happen is you enter the PhD program and like Lane said earlier, you get it along the way. And that you won't have to pay for. The tuition will be waived and you'll get paid in the process. Oh, looks like we have a lab mate of Lane's.
Who is my lab mate and is attending this panel.
Okay, Yash has got to go. And I think this is actually a fairly good time to call it. Thank you all for coming, really appreciate it. And like I said, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to help with whatever I can. Yeah, I hope everyone enjoys their Friday night and just reach out over email if anything comes up. All right. Cool. Bye, Lane.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say, should I linger until everyone leaves?
No, I mean, I
No?
don't think
All
so.
right.
Enjoy your Friday night.
Hi, everyone.
Abdullah, yes, we will send the slides. Okay.